We now continue with Smurf.
When on May 17th, 1988, I learned that my unit was being sent to some secret field mission, all my hopes for a quick return home crumbled like a house of cards. By that time, I had already been demobilized and was literally expecting an order to send me home any day now. If I had only known what was waiting for me ahead, I would have done everything to avoid going there. But then, I was an ordinary conscript, one who had almost served his allotted term in the military, and therefore, I could not violate a direct order from the regiment commander in any way. In addition, we were entitled to decent money, by soldier standards at the very least, for this assignment, a ruble for each day spent there, which could ultimately add up to a good amount. The next day, I was already riding in the back of a cramped Ural with a couple dozen of the same lucky ones as myself. Along with the 24 conscripts in the back of the Ural, our platoon commander, Senior Lieutenant Efemenko, was riding with us, and in the cab, next to the driver, was Lieutenant Colonel Shukov, the regiment's chief of MBC protection. He was a good guy, by the way. He did not pester us with typical army nonsense and told all sorts of funny stories. We traveled to the place for about 2 days, occasionally stopping along the way to eat and relieve ourselves. The Ural's body was closed, so the whole way we were almost in pitch darkness. Only small holes in the awning let in thin rays of light and made it possible to see at least something around us. Every time we stopped for food, I noted to myself that I was moving further and further away from civilization. At first, we had lunch on the side of a fairly busy highway. Sometimes you could even see some village or city in the distance. A day later, it was already a narrow, grassy track surrounded by a dense forest. Upon arrival, as usual, we were immediately lined up in front of the Ural, and our mission was announced. The mission was fairly straightforward. Cordon off the territory in the designated area and report to the higher command in the event of any emergencies or suspicious activity. What was meant by suspicious activity was not specified, just suspicious activity, and then interpret that as you wish. The area that we had to cordon off was the outskirts of some abandoned town, and looking at the houses, and specifically at the balconies of the 5-story panel buildings and the laundry hanging on them, it was obvious that not too long ago, a completely normal, peaceful life was in full swing here. But something had broken this idyllic scene, and people had to be evacuated from here in a hurry. Having carefully listened to all the instructions of Lieutenant Colonel Shukov, AA, we, me and 2 other young men, moved out to the designated area, laying out field communication lines along the way. Our path ran through some garages, ravines, an old hospital, and a small residential area. Having reached the designated place, we immediately settled in one of the abandoned private houses, established field communications there, and began to eat the remains of the dry rations, after which I, as an old-timer, fell asleep, and the 2 young men remained to observe what was happening in case of some emergency or an unexpected visit from some other officer. By the way, on the way, we found out that we were not alone here. In the city besides us, there were a lot of other units of all kinds operating. Some people in white coats were scurrying back and forth and animatedly talking to each other about something. It was difficult to understand what exactly they were doing, but the fussiness and nervousness in their actions made us wary. At about 10 o'clock in the evening, I was awakened by a signal from the field telephone. The commander's panicked voice ordered everyone to put on their OZK, protective gear. At that time, I had known Senior Lieutenant Efemenko for almost 2 years, and it was hard for me to imagine what could have upset him so much, so I decided that something really serious had happened, and I turned out to be right. A couple of minutes later, a powerful explosion was heard from the direction of the city, or rather, Not even an explosion, but a bang. It was so strong that windows blew out all over the city, but no smoke or glow from the explosion was visible at all. After that, a deathly silence reigned in the area, which was interrupted only by someone shouting the command, "Gas." Without thinking for a second, I pulled on an old gas mask and began to peer in the direction where the explosion had occurred a minute ago. And then I noticed how a wall of thick, milky white fog was slowly creeping towards us. No one knew what it was, but it was obvious that it was better not to tempt fate and not try to inhale it. Slowly sliding down the hill, it quietly covered everything that came its way with its veil. When it was our turn and we plunged into it with our heads, I realized that I could not see absolutely anything further than my hands. And a moment later, something happened that I would prefer to forget forever. The field telephone rang, and this time it was Lieutenant Colonel Shukov himself who ordered us to attach our magazines and prepare for battle. Somewhere from the depths of the darkness, the first shots rained down. I don't know who they could shoot at with such visibility, but my instinct told me that I had to do something urgently. And then I remembered that in the next room, I saw a door in the floor leading to the basement of the house. I literally found my young comrades by touch and ordered them to follow me. Crawling on all fours on the floor, I felt the door to the basement, opened it, and we literally fell down. The shots, meanwhile, were getting closer and closer. There was no lighting in the basement, so I ordered everyone to lie on their backs and point their guns at the ceiling in case anyone or anything tried to attack us from there. And we froze, expecting the worst. After about half an hour, the shooting died down. Nothing else happened, except for one loud, heavy breathing, slowly shuffling along the floor as someone walked over us. That is how we spent the next 6 hours. We might have stayed there for another day, just to be safe, but the thought that our unit had simply forgotten about us made us go outside. It wasn't easy, but sooner or later we would have to do it anyway. As the oldest, I went first, lifting up the lid of our shelter. The first thing I noticed was that although quite a lot of time had passed, the strange fog had not gone away. Yes, it had become thinner, but I still could not see anything further than 10 meters. Inside the house where we were hiding, everything was exactly as it had been 6 hours ago. Nothing had changed, except that the field communication had stopped working. There was no point in waiting for any orders from above, so we decided to go to the place where we were initially brought, and where we last saw any of the other officers for the last time. Halfway there, we did not meet anyone at all. It was as if there weren't dozens of soldiers and people in white medical coats scurrying back and forth. But as soon as we reached the hospital, a single shot rang out from somewhere in the depths of the building, and this could only mean that we were not alone there. Leaving one young man on duty at the entrance to the hospital in case anyone else showed up, I headed into the hospital building with the second guy, looking through all the offices along the way in the hope of finding the shooter. In the corridors and offices of the hospital, everything looked as if a real war was going on here. Glass crunched underfoot, and crumbs of plaster fell from the walls. Every time I had to look into the office, I mentally hoped that I would not find anyone there. The whole time that we were walking in the fog, I had an uneasy feeling that I was being watched. But when I entered the walls of the hospital, it intensified tenfold. My internal thoughts were suddenly interrupted by the young man. He cried out in an awkward, childish way, swore sharply, and recoiled from the door. Behind this door lay the torn bodies of 4 people. One of them was sitting with his back to the wall. He was missing both legs up to the knees. A pistol was in his hand, and a thin stream of blood was flowing from his head. As soon as I saw it with my own eyes, everything inside me literally shrank, and my hands began to shake convulsively. The young man, meanwhile, sank to the floor and began to vomit. Having recovered from what we saw, We immediately rushed out of the hospital to our comrade. I ran without looking back, stumbling over scattered furniture, cursing everything and everyone in the world. Having run out of this ill-fated hospital, we did not find anyone. The soldier I left at the entrance to the hospital disappeared, and in the place where he should have been standing, there was a fully loaded machine gun. With all my heart, I wanted to think that he just chickened out and ran away. But I understood that in such a situation, he would never have dropped his weapon under any circumstances. And most likely, he simply did not even have the time to shoot what he came face to face with, what lived in this white darkness. I was overcome by primal fear. I wanted to bury my head in the ground just to hide from this creature. And overcome by this desire, I immediately ran away. I can't say how long I ran, and even where I ran to. I just ran, without looking back, like some prey being chased by a predator. And when fatigue finally got to me, I simply collapsed face down and began to hope for the Lord God to pull me out of this nightmare. Suddenly, the whole area was illuminated by a loud roar, and a second later, the sounds of the first explosions were heard. Not fully understanding what was happening, I turned around and saw bright flashes through the white veil. After each such explosion, the earth literally shook beneath me. I looked at the flickering flashes and no longer understood what was happening. Gathering my last strength, I tried to jump up from my seat to continue my journey, but something threw me aside and I lost consciousness. I woke up in a military hospital, all in bandages and without my left arm. At first, I literally went into hysterics, but looking to the left, I realized that this was a small price to pay for salvation. On the neighboring bed, life was slowly fading away in a bloody and disfigured stump that had once been a man. I remembered poorly what had happened to me as well as the events of the last few days, but I had to remember them when a sullen man in civilian clothes and a couple of other military men came through the door of the ward. As it turned out, after the blow-off happened, someone managed to report what had happened to the higher command, and a preemptive airstrike was carried out on the zone. And when a group was sent there to finally clean up the territory, this group found me unconscious, lying near the road leading to the city. After this incident, only 2 eyewitnesses of the tragedy remained alive. These were me and Lieutenant Colonel Shukov, the same stump lying on the neighboring bed. For obvious reasons, he could not tell anyone about what happened, and therefore, these people concentrated all of their efforts onto me. Having carefully interrogated me, they clearly explained that no one except them and me should know what happened. According to the documents, I was registered as an Afghan warrior, awarded the Order of Courage, and even came up with a legend about how I heroically fought in a column carrying provisions to some remote garrison, how I suddenly ended up on the Tajik-Afghan border from a Siberian town. No one really explained. I just ended up there, and that's it. Shukov died on that bed a couple of weeks later, and I was left alone with the nightmares that torment me at night to this day. Every time I fall asleep, I see the faces of the young guys who disappeared there, whose names I don't even remember, the groans of the lieutenant colonel slowly dying on the next bed, and the heavy breathing of something creeping somewhere in that thick fog, in that thick darkness. Hey, hope you've enjoyed the story so far. If you want to hear more, make sure to subscribe, like the video, and leave a comment because it lets YouTube know you like the content and helps more people to see these videos. My next big goal for the channel is 100,000 subscribers, and as a celebration, I will be doing a Q&A video once we hit that goal. Thank you, and back to the stories. I was always interested, especially in my youth, in the subject of stalking, anomalies, near UFO topics. Sometimes I read the tabloids just for information about these kinds of mystical and strange things, but everything was just an amateur level of writing, and nothing was ever really convincing. Then I met my wife. I moved. I had more worries. I forgot about my hobby because of these worries. I forgot about my interest for a long while and never got the chance to do much research. I often visited my parents, and sometimes I would chat with my mother about the above-mentioned topic. She is an ardent fan of the X-Files. Quite by chance, we came to discuss the phenomenon of EG, electronic voices, and she remembered her grandfather on my father's side. She used to tell me to go and visit my grandpa and tell him that my mother told me to ask. She told me he had a lot of insight into the strange and paranormal world. I rarely saw my grandparents, even though we lived practically across the street. My grandfather was a respected man during the Soviet era, a party activist, a House Council member, and also a survivor of the siege of Leningrad. After the Great Patriotic War, he lived in Kuibyshev for some time, where he also served in the military. He was almost a professional soldier, but due to his health, his lungs were chilled during the siege of Leningrad. He was written off to the reserve, after which he successfully worked in the rocket industry at a local paramilitary production facility. My father, however, like me, who is telling you the story, did not follow in his footsteps. My dad became a technologist, and I became a programmer/reporter. Several weeks have passed since the conversation with my mother about electronic voices. The information I received flew out of my head easily and naturally, and in general, nothing reminded me to make an appearance for a while. That was until my parents kept insisting that I and my wife should pay a visit to my grandfather for his birthday that was coming up shortly. She told me that it would make him happy and that I could finally ask him. The family celebration successfully ended with crockery, and all those gathered began to distribute themselves in groups around the apartment to chew over some of their own topics. My grandfather, dad, and I stayed in the guest room, chatting about life. Actually, it was here that the memory of my mother's words returned. "Grandpa, listen, you served in Kuibyshev, didn't you?" My grandfather turned his gaze to me attentively. "I served in communications in Kuibyshev. What made you suddenly remember this?" Yes, my mother and I were discussing the phenomenon of electric voices. There was silence in the room. My grandfather and father looked at me attentively. My grandfather asked my father and asked if he had already mentioned something. He mumbled something about the Statute of Limitations and whether speaking about his service was wise. "What did your mother tell you about my service?" My grandfather adjusted his glasses while he said this to me. "Mom said that you served as a radio operator, so I wanted to ask." "You wanted to ask? Okay, I will tell you then." Visiting Grandpa ended up lasting well past midnight, but overall, it was worth it. I will tell you a few stories, although I don't really believe them to be that scary. Story 1, The Call. My grandfather served in a radio center with the documentary name, Object Number 15. Now, in principle, there is nothing secret about it. It was several high-altitude antennas, bunkers, something else. It was built in 1939 to 1940, and, for those times, it generally had pretty solid capacity. By the time of his service, it was no longer as modern as one would like, but it still functioned. Locals said that it was part of the perimeter system. Someone said that it was connected to a network of underground bunkers under the city itself. In general, a lot of all sorts of rumors and unverified information. My grandfather, who just studied to be a radio technologist, got to the equipment after university. The work was simple. Fix what is broken, and what is not broken, just clean it and wipe it down as best as you can. Well, and keep watch on the air. Listen, transmit, but more often, just listen. The Union, the Cold War, the danger of a global nuclear catastrophe. There was no escape from this. Everything was strict. Sometimes, it happened. We would come across foreign radio stations, listen to the music, understand nothing, and jump to the next frequency. Occasionally, we would pick up broadcasts from the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. Of course, we would immediately write them down. Suddenly, there was spy information. It was Friday evening. Grandpa came on duty at 1 o'clock, and as usual, began to twist the knobs, press the buttons, listening to the air. Some frequencies were white. There was nothing but noise. There were civil aviation negotiations. The day was boring, dragging on slowly. There was no particular workload. Grandfather was always on call with the technician. That evening, Victor was sitting next to him. Tall, thin, as they would say now. He looked like a nerd. He sat completely unperturbed and cold-blooded. He was like a stone-cold rock face, completely emotionless. The clock in the bunker showed 11:15 p.m., or thereabouts, when the green incoming transmission light on the stand began to blink. Grandfather clicked the switches, aimed at the frequency, and turned on the microphone. 15, on the line. Are you receiving me, loud and clear? There's a... Hear who? The noise of the interference interfered with the transmission. 15, on the line. Do you receive me? If a signal has come, the grandfather thought, then the frequency is ours, someone from the army. Oleska, is that you? A chill ran down Grandpa's spine. This is the 15th. Who are you? Are you receiving? Oleska, my good man. Did you pass it on to headquarters? Were you able to? Did you succeed? Over. Who is this? Oleska, it's me. The voice trailed off. Oleska, what's the date? Grandfather glanced at Victor, who nodded. I'm recording all of this on tape, don't worry. This is the 15th. Over. If I understood you correctly, today is May 17th. Who is speaking? There was just white noise covering the airwaves. Oleska, it happened again. You don't remember. You don't know yet. The green incoming signal light went out. Grandfather, after a few seconds of hesitation, dialed the unit commander on the internal phone. Half an hour later, the commander arrived. 6 soldiers and 2 NKVD men, Soviet Union Intelligence Agency. The recording was confiscated and listened to. Victor was sent to the neighboring unit. Grandfather signed a non-disclosure agreement that would last indefinitely. Story 2, Call to the Peninsula, was probably in the late 70s to 80s. Grandfather served successfully at the facility. Some bigwigs from the Kremlin came to Kubyshev, either for an inspection or for some other reason. It was a quiet, unhurried day. Grandfather Oleg was sitting on the line when the green incoming light signal came on. They called from the north. An excited voice introduced himself as Colonel Shirokov and said that he was calling from the town of Zapolyarny, asking if anyone from the Kremlin had arrived. Wow, the grandfather thought then. Is this real, or is this just something designed to test us? Less than 5 minutes later, the hermetic door creaked open, and the unit commander burst into the communication center. Attention, line up. Grandfather and his partner jumped up, saluting. Some people in the uniform entered. Soldier, did you receive from Zapolyarny? Yes, sir. Connect me. The grandfather turned on the transmitter and asked the addressee. Shirokov. The man in the uniform pushed the grandfather away from the microphone. Shirokov, what the hell is going on? I don't know what to tell you. There was an emergency at SG. 6 200ths, 7 missing. We've cordoned off the area, waiting for orders. Carry out the order. The man in uniform hung up. The entire delegation quickly left the bunker, leaving behind a bunch of questions and an order not to disclose. Story 3, 23rd. Service is service. Nothing can be done about it. You have to stay calm, even when you should be nervous. Sometimes, there were more questions than answers. It was summer, mid-July, scorching hot. Half of the men were doing maintenance work when the unit was raised on alert. Everyone took their places. The commander ran into the bunker, clearly agitated. Listen to the order, soldiers. The alert is combat ready, but there is no reason to panic. This is not a war. Listen to the Pacific Ocean immediately. Report all transmissions. The bunker was flipping through frequencies, every now and then stumbling upon civilian ones. I hear a transmission. Allied encryption. The ship's number is transmitting. Check the signal. Comrade Commander, the number is not on the list of ships. Listen further. Bring this signal to the speakers. Grandfather turned over his shoulder. A strange order, not according to regulations. There is a stable signal. Everyone be quiet, the commander yelled. The transmission was conducted in pure Russian. The coordinates and a distress signal were broadcast. Over. This is Soyuz, engaged in combat. requesting air support. Over, over, this is Soyuz. We have launched missiles. Visual confirmation of warhead detonation. The blast wave arrived 14 seconds after the flash. Thermal damage, minimal, on the starboard side. Crew losses, 12 on the flash side. The commander listened intently. Can anyone hear me? This is the nuclear battleship, Soviet Union. I need help. I'm on... The transmission disappeared in a wave of noise. You may ask what is strange about the story. The battleship of Project 23, Sovietsky Soyuz, did not exist at all. Not only that, but there were certainly no nuclear subs in use anywhere near the area, and not by that name. The flash that they were talking about, we have no idea what it was. We were left with only questions. Story 4, No Reason. Closer to wintertime, my grandfather got pneumonia in his left lung. These were the consequences of the blockade. He was successfully treated in the hospital and was on the mend. Around lunchtime, some kind of commotion began in the corridor. The doctors and the staff were rushing back and forth. My grandfather looked out of the ward and froze. Several soldiers were running along the corridor. One was definitely from the 15th. Behind them, the doctors were rolling a gurney with something or someone. The sheet covering them was crimson with blood. The soldiers were yelling for everyone to leave the corridor. When the delegation ran past the ward, my grandfather saw with horror a blue-gray hand hanging down, with blood flowing like a stream. There was a stir in the wards. Everyone was discussing what had happened. An accident at the shooting range, a brawl with weapons. The door to the ward opened with the head doctor. Comrade vacationers. The chief was a humorous man, but the expression on his face indicated that he was not in the best mood. We are transferring you to the second building, to the trauma ward. Lie down there. Comrade doctor, asked the sergeant with the flu, is there some kind of emergency? I'm sorry, but you were not supposed to know. They told me that I cannot tell anybody anything. Grandfather was the first to collect his things, get dressed, and go out into the corridor. The floor had already been wiped by the nurse, who was unusually gloomy and nervous. On the way to the exit, there was a T-shaped intersection of corridors which went into the operating room about 10 meters away. This is where the surprise awaited. The walls of the operating room were smeared with blood and some kind of bile or chemical reagent. It must be something serious, thought the grandfather, casually glancing at the half-open doors of the operating room. And he froze. He froze himself. His gaze froze. His breathing froze. There was an operation going on behind the doors, and judging by the screams, for a living person. The entire floor was covered in blood. Doctors were running around, but the most important thing that was in front of the doors, a nurse was sitting on a chair and crying loudly, clutching to her chest what was left of her hand. The place where the brush of her right hand should have been was wrapped in gauze or a rag, through which a crimson liquid was oozing. Grandfather stood rooted to the spot until a soldier caught him. The ward, consisting of the grandfather and 3 other soldiers, went out onto the street where there was an unusual amount of activity. The entrance for the gurneys was covered in blood, and a UAZ with soldiers was on duty nearby. Less than 2 minutes later, screams were heard from the operating rooms, and then shots from an AK. What the hell is going on here? The head doctor jumped out of the central entrance and ran towards the military, muttering under his breath, "You listen to it, you bastards. 5-200s, 5-200s. Grandpa and company were picked up by doctors who had come running from the trauma ward and taken to the building. Everyone was told that there had been an accident. A soldier's sister had died, and he had gone crazy, killed a fellow soldier, and wounded 2. Word of mouth spoke of 9 bags in the unit, 4 in the hospital, and a nurse who died 3 days later. These are the stories Grandfather Oleg summed up, believe it or not. Better yet, go take a couple of pieces of cake with you and go home to sleep. That was the last story he ever told me.